Well, good morning. I'm Jeff Coleman.
And I'm Deborah Pinkerton. Welcome to Morning Light.
Well, in just a moment, our Morning Light panel will go behind the headlines.
But first, here's a preview of what's coming up later in the show. Pilgrims were Calvinist Protestants seeking religious freedom from the King of England. But do we know where they worship first? Well, I talked with a historian. Plus, 77 years ago. Always wanted to say that.
You did.
President Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address on this date back in 1863.
Did you
We will take
memorize it?
a closer look. I did not. Did you?
You didn't? Oh, kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you to recite it now.
I'll have you recite it, though.
Well, a few weeks ago, our friend Pastor Josh Robertson, a pastor and education champion right here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, hosted Ohio Senator J.D. Vance at the Rock Church in Harrisburg. And the conversation was about helping students find their full potential, whether public, private, Christian, or homeschool. It was a historic conversation he had a few weeks ago with now Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. But last night's town hall was a little different, on the same stage with Dr. Cornel West. Now, this Christian progressive who ran as an alternate to both presidential candidates this year was one for the books. Pastor Robertson invited him to share his views on how to help all children have access to a safe, nurturing education.
Now, Dr. West is instantly recognizable as one of the leading faces of Black intellectuals.
Face.
That's right, holding posts at Princeton and Harvard. And today, he's the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary. Well, this year, he took his message as a champion for love and justice to become an independent candidate for president. Dr. West doesn't want to be identified with a political party, but a follower of Jesus.
And that's an extraordinary thing, because this is a person from the political left really balancing out this conversation with J.D. Vance, but the common denominator was Jesus. So last night, Pastor Robertson asked Dr. West a very pointed question about how do we bring a country back together, certainly after the election, but are there things we have in common that draw us together? Here's the clip.
Well, I mean, all of us know that love is not reducible to politics. I'm going to love grandmama. I don't care what kind of politics she has. I'll disagree with her, but I won't start with the disagreement. That would be the fourth moment, further on down the line. You see, and we know that deep friendships are not reducible just to agreement on political analysis. You can see that in the barbershops and the beauty salons. There's some folk with high quality that you disagree with. There's folk around the table at Thanksgiving dinner that you love, that you disagree with. The question is just taking those experiences serious enough to recognize in a larger society where things are so polarized and gangsterized that distrust becomes the starting point.
Trust becomes the starting point. Welcome to our Morning Light panel this morning. This has been just a fascinating 24 hours with Dr. West coming to your church, coming to your neighborhood. Now, look, for conservatives, for people who are watching today, they see Dr. Cornel West and they go, what? And you're talking about him on Morning Light. And why that exclamation point is there? Because he's very different politically on a lot of the social issues, pro-life, not pro-life, many issues where Republicans and Democrats would be divided. But here he is in a church, and the message last night was a message of unity, that it is actually possible for people who hold these different views. Now, I'll be honest, there are many people out there who think it's not possible. If you are a Christian, you should believe one way or the other. How did you approach this conversation, Pastor, last night with Dr. West?
Well, fundamentally, I wholeheartedly believe that what unites us is significant. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. Mm-hmm. And the truth of the matter is, the closer we get to Jesus, the closer we draw to one another. And so I think I appreciated the commentary from Dr. West because he really brought out the message of it's Jesus that unites us. It's Jesus who keeps us together. It's our convictions concerning him that produces real unity that transcends politics, culture, and anything else.
Dr. White, you were in the audience with your wife, Jen. That, to many people, is shocking to think that you could be a Christian and actually have views that don't align with, say, Republican or conservative politics. How do you help interpret that for people out there?
Yeah, well, I love the way he said it. He said agreement is not requisite for unity. But he did identify that trust is essential. and trust is earned. And he further stated that trust is born out of a mutual struggle, struggling together, entering into community together. And really that's what this gentleman oozed humility, love, grace, but there was also calls to action, to get involved. And my mind went right to Henry V's monologue of we few, we lucky few. Today, he who bleeds with me will be my brother. And that's not a call to bravado so much as a call to give of yourself, to die to self. He mentioned that multiple times. Die to self, give yourself to something greater than yourself.
What does that mean when you hear Christians? Because everyone who watches this program does not identify as a Christian.
Yeah.
But when they hear this notion of dying to self, and Dr. West said that again and again and again, that the path to relationship with God, but the path to a relationship with your fellow man is dying to self. What does that mean?
Yeah, obviously it doesn't mean to put yourself to literal death. It's laying aside your rights, privileges, preferences in lieu of what you see in front of you, somebody who's suffering, hurting, longing, in need. Am I willing to lay aside my comforts, my own personal desires in a moment and enter into that space? And that is really where that struggle happens together, that I see you, I understand you, and even if I don't fully understand, I'm going to listen to you. So it's being present. It's stepping outside of yourself and entering into the life of another person.
There's some people that hear justice and they think, but those people, and you could fill in the blank, got themselves into that situation, or those people could move other places. They don't have to live in a bad neighborhood, in a bad school district. They could get why don't they just leave and go to a school district that works, or why don't they pull out their kids and go to a Christian school? What are we talking about here, this notion of justice?
Well, I think that this is the challenge that a lot of us face when we live in bubbles. And it's very easy to live in bubbles and not understand things. And so that's why I appreciate what Josh has done, whether from J.D. Vance to Cornel West. Having a conversation with people that you're not going to agree with everything, that trying to listen to understand, not just to have a reply, a retort to something. And I think that that's the challenge for all of us. And I think kind of what Dr. White's talking about when it comes to dying to yourself. To me, when I hear that, it's humility, right? I mean, we hear the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, all of these things. And Tim Keller said something, very profound for me, was like, all of that fruit is buried in the soil of humility. Without humility, and to me, that's how we have to enter into these things of like, I feel firm in my convictions, both spiritually and politically,
right.
And I think that they are right, but having the humility of like, I want to understand what it is that you have to say that's a differing perspective. And I think that we as Christians, that we're called to do that, right? It's a challenge because we dig in, but to me, that's the real opportunity of how you can break down barriers that might exist because of politics or religion.
Pastor, when some people are hearing him say that, they're hearing Matt say, but you can't just let that go. You've got to challenge that. You've got to, if that person is wrong politically, you've got to get in there and tangle with them. It seems to me that what he is saying is you can do that at some point in the relationship, but maybe you don't lead with that. Is that what you heard him say?
Absolutely. I mean, from spending the day with Dr. West,
it was a force of nature.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
But every room he went into that room with love, with a concern. When I met him, he knew my wife's name, he knew my mother's name, he knew my dad's name, right? He knew my children's name. He was thoroughly concerned with me as a person. Before we got to any issues, it was, hey, brother, how you doing? Right? And I think that's where you start, that humility. And I think that is what prepares you to have the tough conversations, because you are more open to have a tough conversation when you know you're loved and you're in a safe environment with somebody who's approaching you not from a hubris or from a condescension type of way, but no, someone who's approaching you from a fellow humanitarian, someone who loves Jesus and loves you and wants to take a journey of seeing how we can accomplish truth together. And that's what I think Dr. West exudes.
Let me share a quote with you that he said a few years ago, which was really addressing this idea of identity politics, that we are first whatever identity you determine. I'm a Christian, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, or socialist, or liberal, or progressive, whatever. And here's what Dr. West says. He says, The criteria instead is always going to be integrity, intellectual, spiritual, moral integrity. It's going to be honesty, intellectual, moral, and spiritual honesty. It's going to be concerns about courage and concerns about decency. And in the end, that means I look at the world through more of a spiritual lens. Is that the right way? Is he right in this and not looking at the labels we might put on our social media profiles or our bumpers on our car?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I hear in that is a call to be honest, to be truthful about who we are. And that requires us to be humble, to see ourselves accurately. I think he called out last night that stop being so surprised by evil or perhaps what is broken or different from ourselves. On the one hand, that tells us that we're not seeing ourselves accurately. Because we are broken, we are in need. He even mentioned last night, you guys can help me out, but it was, before you need to forgive your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart.
Wow. Love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So that says that you're seeing yourself accurately and not being surprised by the brokenness of others or what's around you or even evil.
Yeah, I think, what I take from that is actually I reflect on something that Pastor Josh said last night of being honest about things, where if you're a Democrat and you're passionate about some of the things that Democrats care about, champion those things, but also be prophetic, which I thought speaking into the things where they're inaccurate. Whether it's for us as Christians, the pro-life issue, obviously front and back end of death, even as we talked about it yesterday. But to me, that's the important thing, that we're willing to take on our own tribe, if you will, of calling out inaccuracies or
so
truth,
hard
or
to
where
do
we're not.
sometimes, isn't it?
It absolutely is, because I mean, as
pride
Josh
can turn
said,
on you.
that's right, and that's the challenge that I think that we face. But we're called to stand up for those things, even when we might disagree. It's kind of, defending free speech that I don't agree with. I think we're called to do that as Christians.
I'll let that be the final word today. Dr. West stopped by the studio. He recorded a podcast segment with you, which we'll be sharing with our viewers that you can download and watch. But at the end, we had him sign our wall. And it's always interesting to see what our guests sign. And this is what Dr. West signed. To God be the glory, love Cornel West. And if there's anybody that exudes the love of Jesus, it is Cornel West. So thank you all very much for the conversation today. Well, coming up next on Morning Light, the Pilgrims set sail from England aboard the Mayflower, seeking religious freedom in the New World. They landed in Cape Cod, present-day Massachusetts, on this very date, back in 1620. Deborah sat down with a local historian to learn more about their extraordinary journey. Well, can you believe it? Thanksgiving is next Thursday. We have so many reasons to be grateful to God for our family, our health,
and the right to worship. We can thank the Pilgrims for that. And on this day in 1620, the Pilgrims sought religious freedom, advancing the Christian faith. Well, I sat down with historian Dr. Miles Hodges to find out more. Dr. Hodges, thanks for being with us. Let's talk about the Pilgrims landing in Cape Cod in 1620.
All right. One of my favorite times in history, because they were people who set the stage for what America was to become. They were a people of tremendous ideals, ready and willing to face what they understood were the death and dying probabilities, in fact. But they were so committed to the cause of bringing the light of Jesus Christ to the New World and establishing it there as a city on a hill. So yeah, I love them. I know them as separatists. We know them as pilgrims. They're pilgrims because they made the pilgrimage, but what identified them was their separatism. They were Puritans, Calvinists, like the Puritans, but unlike the Puritans, they gave up on the idea that there was any possibility of serious reform of the church in England, so they separated, which put them in grave danger with the monarchy. The king could tolerate the Puritans, but he had no toleration whatsoever for separatists who would dare to step out of the Church of England's world. They therefore had to escape to the Netherlands, where they lived the next 10 years, but conditions there were not ideal. It was a time of attack from the Spanish, and their kids were starting to develop ways. They knew they had to move on. They knew that was going to have to be somewhere in the New World. And so they applied for a petition to settle in what they called Northern Virginia. They left the Netherlands, and in their effort to get away on the Atlantic, in first of all the Speedwell, that ship along with the Mayflower, they had to turn back twice and leave it and crowd onto the Mayflower. By the time they were finally underway, it was late in the season. The winds and the activity of the Atlantic at that point is really bad. Consequently, when they made their way across, they didn't come to Northern Virginia. They knew from the maps that John Smith had prepared that they were at this place called Cape Cod. The idea was they would try to turn south and reach the destination that they were legally allotted to. They couldn't get around the corner because the winds were all moving, so they knew they were going to have to settle there.
And that is amazing that they did that. And what's even more amazing is that they took a stand because of their faith. What can we learn from the Pilgrims?
What can we learn from the Pilgrims? Again, I like the word perseverance. In the face of incredible adversities that life can throw at you, there are always greater causes. There's a higher purpose to everything, even in times of war and famine. And they understand. You still push forward. And so they did. So much so that God, in his own little humorous way, sent them some English-speaking Indians who showed them how to survive. And they were so enthralled, they finally, that same October, had a Thanksgiving feast with their Indian friends. Just a powerful reminder that in all things, give thanksgiving the way they did. That has inspired us over the centuries.
And so as we get ready to celebrate Thanksgiving, we have to remember to give thanks.
Absolutely. That's exactly what the word means. It isn't just thanksgiving to our fertilizer company. It's thanksgiving to God. America is a very different society in the sense that it understands it's always been a covenant nation, and it has always been God that is behind these, and it is always to God that we direct our thanks.
Dr. Hodges, thank you so much for giving us this insight.
Oh, you're more than welcome. God bless you, dear.
And it is really amazing what they did, all because of their faith.
Well, but I think what Dr. Hodges is saying, which is fascinating, is that everywhere along the journey, God had pre-positioned people, resources, a lot of surprises. So the original plan was one way, and God's plan
was another way.
Absolutely.
And including the people that they met along the way, too.
Pretty cool.
Absolutely. Pretty cool. And we're going to be talking about President Lincoln coming up. But I think it's also interesting to note that he was the one who declared the fourth Thursday Thanksgiving, a national holiday.
He did, and we have a lot to be thankful for, but especially the notion and idea of freedom, and freedom of religion, freedom to worship.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, coming up next on Morning Light.
President Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address on this date in 1863. So why do his words still resonate 161 years later? We'll explain after the break.
161 years ago, President Abraham Lincoln delivered a short speech at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg. A local Harrisburg newspaper declared they were silly remarks. Well, in November of 2013, the editorial board of that same newspaper retracted their somewhat premature assessment.
Yeah, I think they were wrong.
I think
they were
so,
wrong.
too.
Well, why has the Gettysburg Address endured? Was it the way Lincoln used the language and cadence of Scripture, or King James Bible phrasing like fourscore, or the new birth of freedom? Or was it the idea of the equality of man coming straight from the pages of the Bible? I asked retiring Franklin County Representative Paul Schemmel why year after year Lincoln's speech outlasts all the others. The Gettysburg Address was just 272 words in length. The average formal address by President Trump, 5,580. Lincoln's speech would have taken around 3 minutes to deliver. And while it wasn't written on the back of a napkin, as some folklore suggests, every word and phrase was chiseled by a master wordsmith. Franklin County Representative Paul Schemmel, an attorney and practiced public speaker, explains why this short speech outlasts most others.
It's interesting and somewhat ironic. The Gettysburg Address, Lincoln himself says that few will remember what we say here, yet here is a short speech that we remember so many years later.
But why does the Gettysburg Address endure 160 years after the words left Lincoln's mouth? He argues it's more than beautiful words.
First and foremost, where is it set? Gettysburg, not long after the battle, at the site where all of these brave men have been buried. And that's what Lincoln talks about, is these brave men that have been buried, why did they die? Why did they fight? And interesting, he does not go into just what I would say would be the politics of the day, and that would be, as a politician, that would be our impulse to talk about, well, what's happening right here and right now. Instead, Lincoln takes the long view. What does this mean for our nation? What does it mean for the cause of liberty? And that's how he begins. He begins the Gettysburg Address with that, saying, this is for what? It's for the equal protection of all. This is the proposal that we have. That's why these men fought. That's why they died. And Jeff, that's why we remember it today.
But Schemmel argues Lincoln wasn't only speaking to the audience at Gettysburg, but to generations yet unborn, a kind of advice in a time capsule.
There's a line in the middle of the speech where Lincoln says, this is for us the living. And I think when he says this is for us the living, he means for the living at any time. He might not have known or been aware that his speech would endure the way it has. But he talks about the dead and why they have died. But what does he tell us? He says, this is the obligation of those of us who are now here because of the heroic acts of these men, is to do what? To bring forward those precepts that were laid out by our founders in equality to all men.
The speech, he says, connected to another moment, 100 years later.
100 years later, we would see Reverend Martin Luther King talk about a check that was written out by the founders to be cashed. Part of that deposit of the tradition of the nation was laid out on the battlefield in Gettysburg and then extended by the words of Lincoln saying, this is the duty for those of us who live.
Representative Schemmel says Lincoln's little speech is a guide star for him and future generations of Americans.
I can say it lives in my heart, and I learned it long after it was given. And my own children, who've had to memorize the Gettysburg Address in their school, just as I did when I was a child, it lives in their heart as well. Because it has eternal truths of what we are as a nation and the ambitions of what we are as a nation, which is not to be rich and powerful, but instead what? To be a light to the nations, something that William Penn had said about the founding of Pennsylvania, to the equality of all men, which is reflective of the Declaration of Independence. And that's why it's as relevant today as it was the day that Lincoln said it.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Deborah, when you think of the Gettysburg Address as a note written from a president to future generations, I think I want to go back and read that today that way, because it's for us. It's a letter to us.
Yeah, it's certainly a wonderful thing that he said. And you said you can recite it?
I can, but not here.
Not
here.
now. Not now.
Well, I guess in some ways the lessons of the Gettysburg Address are when you're invited to speak, be brief, be good, and be gone. And of course, on the night of the Gettysburg Address, November 19th, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln attended a patriotic service at the Gettysburg Presbyterian Church at the end of a long 25-hour whirlwind tour of that beautiful community.
And as we were talking, you told me that he did leave before the services concluded to catch the 7 p.m. train back to Washington, D.C. And we talked earlier that that was the same church where Dwight D. Eisenhower attended.
That's right. Dwight and Mamie were attenders there. We did a special on that relationship with that church. It's a special place, indeed.
Stay with us. We will be right back.
Welcome back to Morning Light. Well, I never expected to get a hug from Dr. Cornel West, but yesterday I got 4 of them, and he hugged just about everyone he met, showing an indiscriminate level of respect and honor to the person standing in front of him. It was always, you first. It was an honor to meet you. And of course, he's the famous intellectual who taught at Harvard and Yale and Princeton. He's sometimes pretty provocative and always powerfully articulate, but he makes it a practice to follow the admonition of the Apostle Paul to outdo one another in showing honor. He didn't talk politics or try to embarrass or expose his political opponents. They were always my brother or my sister. And yesterday, he wouldn't stop talking about this relationship with Jesus. Again and again, in different ways, he reminded us there's no skin color, degree, accomplishment, or identity that surpasses that ultimate relationship. As a Christian, he called himself a cracked pot, in allusion to Paul's reminder the gospel isn't carried by the perfect and the beautiful, but by jars of clay. I needed that reminder, and I know a lot of people did too. What a reminder of God's amazing grace. Thanks for watching today. For Deborah and the entire Morning Light team, I'm Jeff Coleman. Go check on your neighbors. God willing, we'll see you again tomorrow morning.